get out of our lives and keep that ranch. My daughter-in-law's voice cut through the lawyer's office like a blade. I sat there clutching the strap of my worn purse, and for the first time in 68 years, I truly felt invisible. My name is Elaine Carter, a widow of 3 days still wearing the black dress I buried my husband Harold in. Across the table, my only son Daniel wouldn't look at me. The boy I raised through night shifts and unpaid bills stared at his folded hands as if they belonged to a stranger. His wife Vanessa polished and triumphant leaned back with that smug smile that told me I was nothing but an inconvenience. In that moment, with the scent of leather books and dust pressing against me, I realized my husband's death wasn't the hardest blow. It was being told I no longer had a place in my own family. The silence in the lawyer's office stretched until it felt like the walls were closing in. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and went back to reading the will in his practiced monotone, but I barely heard the words. All I could think about was how fast the ground had shifted beneath me. 3 days ago, I was a wife and a mother. Now I was a widow and something less than a mother, at least in Daniel's eyes. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other, her high heel dangling in the air as if she owned the place. "Let's not drag this out," she said with a dramatic sigh. "Elaine will take that dusty ranch and will handle the real assets. It makes sense for everyone." I wanted Daniel to speak. I wanted him to lift his head and remind his wife that family means more than convenience, that I deserved more than to be cast aside like an old piece of furniture. Instead, he shifted in his chair and muttered, "Maybe it's for the best, Mom. You and Vanessa never really got along. Never got along." The words stung worse than anything Vanessa had said, as if this were some silly feud between two women, not a deliberate effort to push me out of my son's life. I pressed my lips together and held tight to the strap of my purse. I'd once worked double shifts at the diner so Daniel could have braces, so he could go on school trips, so he could dream bigger than I ever could. Now he couldn't even defend me against his wife's contempt. When Mr. Henderson finished, he gathered the papers in a neat stack and avoided my eyes. He had seen this scene play out too many times, families crumbling in the face of money. Vanessa rose first, smoothing her expensive skirt. She leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume, sharp and floral. "Enjoy your little exile, Elaine," she whispered, sweet as venom. "Maybe the quiet will give you time to think about your mistakes." I stood slowly, afraid my knees might betray me. "I'll pack my things," I said softly. Vanessa's smile widened. Daniel stayed seated, still staring at his hands. He didn't come after me when I walked out. He didn't even call my name. The sunlight outside felt harsh, almost cruel as I stepped onto the street. My car was parked a block away, its paint faded the trunk half full of old boxes I never had time to sort through. I slid behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I thought I had lost everything at Harold's funeral. But driving away from that office, I realized grief was only the beginning. Losing Harold had broken my heart. Losing Daniel, losing the place I held in his life, was breaking my very sense of self. And yet somewhere deep inside, a seed of defiance stirred. The next morning, I drove back to the house where I had lived for more than 4 decades. Every clapboard, every rosebush by the porch, every worn step leading to the front door carried pieces of my life. Yet when I opened the door with my own key, I felt like an intruder. The walls seemed colder, emptier, as if Harold's absence had pulled the warmth out of the place. Daniel wasn't there to help me pack. I knew he wouldn't be. Vanessa had likely made sure of it. She wanted the process clean, final, like sweeping dust into a bin. I gathered photo albums, Harold's old flannel shirts, a quilt my mother had sewn before she passed. Every item felt like an anchor, and yet I couldn't leave them behind for Vanessa to toss away. From the upstairs window, I caught sight of her. Vanessa stood by the kitchen sink, watching me through the glass. She didn't wave or pretend to smile. Her arms were folded, her lips pressed into that satisfied line that told me she was already redecorating the house in her head. For a fleeting second, I wanted to scream at her, to pound on the window and demand she remember I was the woman who raised the man she married. But I swallowed it down. She would have loved that scene, me raging while she looked calm and victorious. I loaded box after box into the trunk of my car. No one came out to carry a single load. When the trunk was full, I stacked the rest on the back seat, covering the upholstery with an old blanket to protect it from the sharp corners of picture frames. Finally, I stood in the doorway one last time, staring at the faded wallpaper, the dent in the hall where Daniel had once crashed his toy truck. Memories pressed against me so hard I thought I might break. I locked the door, slid the key under the mat, and walked away. The drive to the ranch stretched long across the open Texas landscape. Fields rolled by in shades of brown and gold. Windmills turned lazily in the distance. The farther I drove, the more I felt the weight of exile pressing against me. By the time the dirt road appeared, my throat ached from holding back tears. The ranch came into view as the sun began to lower. The house slouched against the horizon, its paint peeling the porch-sagging windows clouded with dust. Weeds clawed at the fence posts, and the barn leaned to one side like it had given up years ago. This wasn't a home, it was a sentence. I parked by the porch, switched off the engine, and sat in the silence. No children's laughter, no Harold's cough from the kitchen, no clatter of pots, only wind whistling through brittle grass. I had thought grief was heavy, but loneliness weighed differently. Loneliness pressed into your chest and whispered that you were no longer needed. I carried my boxes inside and set them on the floor of the empty living room. Dust motes swirled in the late light, glowing like tiny ghosts. That night in the sagging farmhouse Harold had once called worthless, I finally let myself sob until I couldn't breathe. Morning light crept through the filthy windows, casting thin streaks across the hardwood floor. I woke on the lumpy couch where I had collapsed the night before, my throat raw from crying. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the smell of mildew and the aching silence reminded me this was home now. I couldn't let despair swallow me whole, so I picked up a rag and a bucket of soapy water and started cleaning. Each swipe of cloth across the furniture seemed to lift not just dust, but years of abandonment. In Harold's old bedroom dresser, I found a boyish collection of arrowheads neatly arranged in a glass case. I had never known he cared about such things. In the study, shelves groaned under the weight of geology books and rock samples, their labels carefully inked in his grandfather's hand. The man I married had lived an entire childhood I never really understood. It was in the kitchen pantry behind a loose board that I discovered the first secret. A small tin box rusted along the edges, wrapped in twine. My hands shook as I pulled it free. Inside lay bundles of yellowed letters written in looping Spanish, dated in the 1940s. The name signed at the bottom was always the same, Isabella. I sat at the table, the house silent around me, and read. These weren't just love letters, though they carried tenderness that made me ache. They spoke of land surveys, of copper veins and mineral rights, of dreams buried in soil. Isabella wrote of their secret and the promise it held for generations. Tucked at the bottom of the box were black and white photographs, a young woman with dark hair and fierce eyes, standing beside a man who looked remarkably like Harold's grandfather. Questions tumbled in my mind. Who had Isabella been? What had happened to her? And why had Harold never mentioned any of this history? Curiosity drove me deeper. In the old study, I rummaged through drawers until I uncovered rolled-up maps, their edges brittle. Red pencil lines traced paths across our ranch land, marked with strange symbols I couldn't decipher. Among them, I found correspondence with the Bureau of Land Management, faded copies of mineral rights applications, even an envelope labeled assay reports. My pulse quickened as I read technical words. I barely understood viable deposits, estimated reserves. The implication was clear enough even to me beneath this tired land. Something valuable slept. I leaned back in the creaking chair, letters and maps spread across the desk. The ranch that Daniel and Vanessa had mocked the place they'd exiled me to might not be a curse at all. It could be the key to everything. Still doubt gnawed at me. If Harold's grandfather had believed so strongly in this, why hadn't it changed anything for him? Why had Harold himself stayed silent all these years? The questions piled higher than the dust I'd brushed away, and they refused to leave me alone. By the third day on the ranch, curiosity had grown louder than grief. I couldn't ignore the papers I'd found, not when they hinted at a truth Harold had never shared with me. I drove into town needing both groceries and answers, and stopped at the corner cafe where gossip flowed as freely as coffee. That's where I spotted Ruth Gardner, a woman who had lived in this town long enough to remember everyone's secrets. Ruth's eyes lit up when she saw me. "Elaine Carter," she said warmly, sliding into the booth across from me. "It's been too long." "How are you holding up?" I hesitated, then lowered my voice. "Ruth, do you remember anything about Harold's grandfather and this ranch? I found some letters and maps. Something about mining." Her smile faded into a knowing expression. She stirred her coffee slowly, as though summoning memories from the bottom of the cup. Samuel Carter. He was convinced there was copper here. Filed claims, drew maps, even hired men to dig. Folks thought he was obsessed. And then there was that woman, Isabella. Caused quite a stir back then. My heart skipped. She's in the letters. What happened to her? Ruth sighed. She died young in childbirth. Samuel never recovered. He kept to himself, working this land like it owed him something. When he passed, the ranch went to Harold's father, but by then people had forgotten all about copper. Everyone just thought the Carters were chasing ghosts. The clink of her spoon against porcelain felt like a punctuation mark. My hands trembled around my cup. Samuel hadn't been chasing ghosts. He'd been chasing a fortune, and Harold must have known. Back at the ranch, I couldn't stop thinking about Ruth's words. That evening, I returned to the study and dug deeper. Behind a false panel in the closet, wrapped in oilcloth, I found another envelope. Inside were updated surveys from the 1970s, far more detailed than anything else. They confirmed substantial mineral deposits written in stark, technical language that made my chest tighten with disbelief. At the bottom lay a more recent document dated less than a year ago. It was a letter from a mining company, Western Minerals, Inc., offering to lease the mineral rights for a staggering sum. Harold had received it just months before his final hospital stay, and he never said a word to me. But tucked beneath that offer was what stopped me cold, a handwritten note in Harold's unmistakable scrawl. "Elaine deserves better than what I gave her. This is her chance. Don't let Vanessa ruin everything." I sank to the floor papers, trembling in my hands. Harold had known. He had kept the secret not from me, but for me. And now it was in my hands. For the first time since he died, I didn't just feel grief. I felt power. The number on the letterhead for Western Minerals burned in my mind for days. I kept the paper folded in my apron pocket as if it were a lifeline, but I didn't dare call until one morning when the silence of the ranch felt heavier than usual. I set the paper on the kitchen table, dialed the number with a shaking hand, and listened as the line clicked. "Western Minerals. This is Claire speaking." My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to answer. "This is Elaine Carter. I believe you made an offer to my late husband about our property." Her tone sharpened with interest. "Mrs. Carter, yes. We've been hoping to hear from you. The copper seam under your land is considered significant. We would very much like to resume discussions." Within a week, 2 representatives arrived in a white pickup that looked too new for the dusty road. The older man introduced himself as Frank Torres, the younger woman as Sarah Lynn. They shook my hand with a respect I hadn't felt in months. Frank's grip was firm, steady, the kind of handshake that said he meant what he promised. We walked the property together. Frank pointed to ridges in the soil, subtle changes in color, and spoke about ore veins lying deep underground. Sarah tapped at a tablet, showing me maps overlaid with bright lines and figures that dazzled me. It's what we call a high-grade deposit, she explained, her voice calm but enthusiastic. This isn't speculation. The yield is measurable and extremely valuable. When they finally sat me down at the kitchen table, Frank laid out numbers I could hardly fathom. We're prepared to offer $4 million up front for a 20-year lease, plus quarterly royalties that could reach $500,000 depending on market prices. My pulse thundered in my ears. $4 million. In one signature, I could change the trajectory of the rest of my life. But before I could even process it, my phone buzzed with Daniel's name on the screen. I didn't answer, not with Frank and Sarah watching, but the timing made my stomach twist. They must have already realized something was happening. That evening, after the representatives left, I listened to Daniel's voicemail. His voice was strained, almost pleading. "Mom, can you call me back? There's a problem with the house. We need to talk." A second message followed, this time, Vanessa's shrill tone cutting through. "Elaine, whatever you're doing, stop playing games. This is about family. You can't just shut us out." I stared at the phone, then set it face down. They had told me to get out of their lives. Now that the ranch had become the crown jewel, they wanted me back in. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat at the table with Frank's contract spread before me, and felt something fierce rising in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't begging for a seat at the table. I owned the table. The calls didn't stop. By the end of the week, my phone showed more missed numbers from Daniel than I could count. I let them pile up unanswered until one night exhaustion overcame caution. I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear. Mom Daniel said, his voice frayed at the edges. "Thank God. I've been trying for days. We need help. The county says there's some issue with mineral rights on our property. They're saying Dad never transferred them when he bought the lot. It's affecting our mortgage. We could lose the house." I leaned against the cool kitchen counter, staring at the stack of documents that proved exactly what he feared. The mineral rights were mine, tied to this ranch, not his manicured suburban lot. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch, until he stumbled on. "We just need a little money to cover legal fees and taxes. Maybe $50,000 just until we refinance. You'd be helping the kids, Mom. You'd be helping us." Vanessa's voice cut in, faint but sharp behind him. "Tell her we'll make space over the garage. She can live there. It'll be perfect, close to the grandchildren, comfortable enough." I closed my eyes. An apartment over the garage. That was their vision for me after I had just been offered millions for the land they'd scorned. Daniel. "I said evenly 3 weeks ago, your wife told me to get out of your lives. She said I had failed as a mother. You agreed it was for the best. Do you remember that silence?" Then a faint "Mom, we were grieving. People say things they don't mean." "No," I replied. "She meant every word, and you let her." Vanessa's tone rose in the background. Elaine stopped dramatizing. "This is bigger than old arguments. We're talking about family security. Don't be selfish." The laugh that slipped from my lips surprised even me, bitter sharp. "Selfish, I worked nights for years so Daniel could eat, so he could go to college. I gave up everything so he'd never feel poor. And now you call me selfish because I won't bail you out of your own greed." Daniel's voice softened, almost boyish. "What do you want me to do, Mom? She's my wife. I'm trying to keep this together. I want you to be the man I raised you to be," I said quietly. "The one who knows the difference between love and control." The silence on the other end told me my words landed. For once, he didn't rush to defend Vanessa. Until then, I added my hand steady on the phone. "Don't call me for money. Call me when you want a relationship." I hung up. The phone buzzed again, instantly, but I set it down, turned out the kitchen light, and let the ranch's quiet wrap around me. 6 months later, the ranch no longer looked like a place of exile. The peeling paint had been replaced with fresh cream. Siding, the sagging porch, now stood straight, with sturdy beams, and solar panels gleamed across the roof, catching the Texas sun. I sat on that porch every morning with a cup of coffee, watching the horizon shift from violet to gold. What once felt like banishment had become a sanctuary. The quarterly report from Western Minerals had arrived that morning. Inside the thick envelope lay a check that still managed to take my breath away. $437,000, my share of the copper sales for the last 3 months. I placed it on the table without ceremony, as though large numbers were now ordinary. Yet no number on paper matched the quiet satisfaction of this life I'd carved from ashes. My phone buzzed beside me. For a moment I didn't check. I had learned not every ring demanded my attention. Most days the calls were from people I wanted to hear Patricia, my attorney, updating me on legal filings. Frank or Sarah from Western Minerals explaining extraction progress. Ruth reminding me she baked too many pies again. But sometimes the caller ID still read Daniel. When I answered his calls now, they were different. The desperate edge had faded, replaced by halting attempts at real conversation. He told me about the children, Emma making the honor roll, Tommy scoring a goal in soccer. He even asked for my pot roast recipe, once his voice quieter, humbler. It wasn't reconciliation yet, but it was something closer to honesty than I'd heard from him in years. Vanessa, on the other hand, had stopped calling altogether. The last time we spoke, she accused me of manipulating Daniel, of turning him against her. I told her calmly that if her marriage was crumbling, it wasn't because of me, it was because of choices she had made. The silence that followed was the last thing I ever heard from her. From Daniel's careful words, I knew they were separated now, perhaps permanently. I didn't gloat. Instead, I invested in myself. I enrolled in a photography class at the community center and discovered I had an eye for capturing the rugged beauty of the land. I took a geology course wanting to understand the veins of copper that had rewritten my future. I even traveled to Santa Fe for a week learning about the native traditions that had shaped this region long before the Carters ever dreamed of copper. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, not as someone's caretaker or backup plan. One evening, as the cicadas droned, Daniel left a voicemail that I played twice. His voice was softer than I remembered, stripped of arrogance. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said about being the man you raised me to be. I'm trying. It's harder than I thought, but I am trying. I love you. I don't think I said that enough." I sat on the porch after listening, watching a hawk circle above the mesa. The words weren't enough to undo years of silence and betrayal, but they were a start. When I called him back, I asked about the kids, and for 20 minutes we talked about Emma's science projects and Tommy's crooked smile. He mentioned that the children missed me, asked if they might come visit the ranch. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the ease of the answer. I want them to see where their grandmother lives now. I want them to know me, not the version Vanessa painted. There was quiet on the line. Then Daniel whispered, "Thank you." As I hung up, the sun dipped lower, painting the land in copper light. The mining rigs in the distance hummed steadily, a reminder of the wealth pouring from the earth. But that wasn't the treasure I cherished. The real treasure was knowing I had drawn a line and claimed my worth finally. I had once been told to get out of their lives and keep this ranch as though it were a curse. They thought they had buried me in loneliness. Instead, they planted me in the richest soil of my life. I sipped the last of my coffee, the evening settling soft around me, and smiled. Revenge hadn't come in shouting matches or dramatic scenes. It had come quietly in checks, signed to my name in a house, filled with laughter, waiting to return in the peace of knowing I had built something untouchable. And that I realized was the sweetest justice of all.